A white flag moved across a shattered street, and a German officer stepped forward, hand up, face hard with refusal. He did not ask for mercy. He announced a decision. This city would not surrender. Those 3 words, refuse to yield, would turn a place of stone and shops into a crucible of ruin. George S. Patton already carried a reputation that made men flinch. He was the general who scolded soft discipline and demanded speed, the general whose temper and toughness had become almost as famous as his victories. He had been accused before of cruelty, of callousness. The slapping incidents, the harsh words to the wounded, all of it fed a public image that made opponents fear him and allies whisper. So when a German commander declared the city a fortress and ordered his men to hold at all cost, many asked, was the punishment that followed an act of necessity or an act of cruelty? If this question matters to you, stay with this story. Subscribe and join us for more deep dives into the moments that shaped history. Patton's Third Army was moving fast through Germany. The campaign's rhythm was speed over hesitation, seize bridges, cut rail lines, keep the enemy from regrouping. The city in question sat on routes the Allies could not afford to lose. For the German defenders, Hitler's last directives had become a doctrine. No retreat, hold fortresses to the last man. That order turned commanders into jailers of their own people. Pride and obedience became weapons sharper than any rifle. The German commander, identified in sources as General Kramer, chose honor as it had been defined for him, never to lay down arms. Whether by fanatic loyalty or rigid military code, he refused the white flag. He and his staff turned streets into traps. They mined the bridges. They loosed snipers from upper windows. They wired stairwells and cellars with explosives. Orders filtered down. Kill anyone who tried to surrender. SS units enforced obedience with summary executions. Civilians were dragged from cellars when their food ran low and told they must stay to keep up appearances. Boys were armed. Old men were told to stand and fight. The city's logic became survival through defiance. The Americans approached with a mixture of impatience and dread. Urban fighting is an animal of its own, close, fragmented, intimate. Tanks cannot see around corners. Infantry must clear rooms. A single sniper can stall a division. Mines chew up engineers and patients alike. Patton understood that taking the city would cost time, men, and eventually the moral standing of whoever ordered the assault. If the garrison fought to the last man, the price would be measured in bodies. The fighting hardened into a grind. 6 days of house-to-house combat turned normal streets into funnels of smoke and glass. Engines stuttered where concrete piles had fallen. Soldiers moved in pairs, then in single file, then as something that resembled dancing. One checked a window, one covered the door. The short sentences of combat, clear the room, toss the grenade, move up, replaced long plans. Mines killed pace. Snipers held pockets of resistance. At night the city sounded like a machine with broken parts. Distant artillery, the cough of a single rifle, the thud of collapsing masonry. Amid the noise there were human questions. A young private, face streaked with soot and eyes too old for his years, looked up from where medics worked and asked, without rhetorical posture, why so many had to die. His question was not a lesson in morals, but a practical plea. How do you tell a mother that her son was killed because the enemy would not quit? A sergeant could not give him an answer beyond the cold facts. The enemy had orders to hold. Orders turned men into instruments. Sometimes instruments broke and bled. Civilians crawled from basements under trembling roofs. Mothers clutched children whose ears still rang from blasts. An old man, a grocer whose shop had been a meeting place for decades, sat among the ruins and watched soldiers step over the shattered counter. He did not see glory in the broken windows. He saw the cost of stubborn commands. Patton walked the lines. He did not gloat. He did not wander for spectacle. He inspected casualties, talked, briefly, with junior officers, and listened to reports of booby-trapped stairwells and buildings made into nests for machine guns. Where others might have cursed and moved on, Patton gathered details as if each fact were a tool to end the misery sooner. He demanded clarity. Who ordered the city to stand? Who refused to accept surrender? The answers shaped his decision. When the garrison finally failed to repel the assault, the city's defenses collapsed not in a single thunderclap, but in a slow unspooling. A house cleared here, a barricade overrun there, a signal of surrender that a unit dared not deliver. The officers who had enforced Hitler's no-surrender line found their authority broken by circumstance. Many men laid down their arms, others were hauled, exhausted, filthy, to temporary pens. And among the captured was the man who had pronounced the city a fortress. General Kramer was brought into an American command post that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and coffee. Outside, the city was still full of smoke and ruin. Inside, the room was small, lit by an oil lamp that cast every face long and honest. Patton sat across from the man who had turned orders into death sentences. The scene had none of the theater the headlines liked to imagine. It was quiet and precise. Kramer did not plead. He did not beg for pity. He made the calculations that had driven him. Duty, obedience, perhaps a belief that holding to the end preserved honor. Patton listened. He had already seen what the refusal had cost: shattered buildings, civilian corpses in cellars, soldiers with their hands blown away, families without homes. Patton spoke in a voice that hardly rose, and which carried a bluntness that left no room for equivocation. He described the deaths he had observed, not as boasts, but as facts placed against choices. He told the captured commander, with a clarity that cut past excuses, that there was a line between brave sacrifice and useless slaughter. He called the decision to hold the city what many survivors and fallen would call it: a stupid, pointless waste of human life. Those words were not an attempt at vengeance. They were a moral verdict. To Patton, the essential failure was not merely military but ethical. To order men to die when no strategic purpose justified their deaths was a dereliction of command. Courage, he argued by implication, requires judgment. To die for a cause is not the same as dying because someone refused to bend for the sake of others' lives. Patton did not pretend that the taking of the city had been without cost. He admitted the slaughter had been terrible. He did not minimize his army's role in killing, but he drew a line between killing as a reluctant instrument of necessity and killing made necessary by fanatic commands that sought to extract honor from ruin. There is an old, bitter calculus in war. Lives lost must mean something other than stubborn pride. Otherwise, the sacrifice becomes senseless, and the leader who allows it becomes culpable. The captured general accepted some portion of that judgment, not by words, but by the way his shoulders dropped. Whether he repented or simply understood that his orders had failed to translate into strategic sense, no one could say with certainty. What mattered was the lesson laid bare in the dimly lit room. Leadership that fetters its own people to outdated or insane directives is a different kind of cruelty. In the days that followed, American command made a practical choice. Leaflets were printed and distributed over other stubborn pockets of resistance. The images and messages were not meant to gloat over wreckage. They were a form of argument by consequence. Show what will happen if commanders force civilians and soldiers to hold ground, regardless of cost. The message was blunt. The price of blind obedience would be visible, and perhaps that might persuade someone else to spare their town and their men. This tactic worked sometimes and not at other times. Fear is an imperfect teacher. Some commanders continued to obey destructive orders, but where leaflets and the reality of shattered cities reached hearts and minds, surrenders followed, and lives were spared. There is a moral pragmatism in that approach. Threaten force not for revenge, but to prevent repetition. To Patton, the calculus was simple and harsh. If demonstrating the consequences of fanatic defense could save more lives later, then the immediate horror had a grim purpose. The question returns, was Patton cruel? The answer is not a single sentence. It is a demand to separate temperament from intention. Patton could be ruthless in manner. He could be impatient with those he judged cowardly or incompetent. But in this episode, his ruthlessness aimed at ending a set of circumstances that produced pointless deaths. He did not celebrate the rubble. He measured it. He marked who had been ordered to fight and who had chosen to resist. He judged responsibility and pronounced a verdict in the low, cutting language he favored. There is also a darker truth. Forcing a city to fall to make a moral point risks repeating the very violence one would condemn. The tactic of hard lessons is perilous. Civilians always pay. War rarely allows clean answers. A commander who decides to end a pointless fight with overwhelming force must reckon with the bodies for which he will be held accountable, whether by history, by law, or by conscience. Historians and contemporaries argued over Patton's method then, and still argue now. Some saw in his action a necessary, if bitter measure, a stern hand to stop larger slaughter. Others saw in it the arrogance of a man who believed the end always justified the methods. Both readings contain truth. Leadership carries the burden of making decisions where every outcome is bitter. When a choice is framed between slow destruction by commanded defiance and sudden decisive assault, the moral compass becomes the leader's only safeguard against arbitrary cruelty. What Patton said that day was not a defense of violence for its own sake. It was a rebuke aimed at commanders who would sacrifice lives to adhere to abstract notions of honor. His words, simple, harsh, unadorned, were meant to be a warning to those who would replicate the same folly. Do not convert human lives into instruments of stubbornness. Call it cruelty, if you will. Patton called it the necessary enforcement of judgment when confronted with orders that created only pointless death. The ruined city remained a testament to that collision between doctrine and lives. Mothers kept their dead, and soldiers returned home with scars that did not show on paper. Patton's reputation did not heal overnight. The slapping incidents and his rough public personality still colored what people believed him capable of. Yet among the men who had been spared future assaults after seeing what defiance cost, some found in his actions a grim logic. If making an example here could prevent a repeat there, perhaps the immediate cruelty would translate into fewer casualties overall. In the quiet that follows combat, the moral problem endures. Bravery loses its value when it becomes a mere tool of futility. Duty becomes monstrous when duty means obedience unto needless death. Leadership, therefore, must always be measured by a question. Does this order preserve life and secure a meaningful objective, or does it ask for sacrifice without purpose? Patton, in his blunt way, answered that question in the face of a man whose orders had done just that. He called the choice what it was, a stupid, pointless waste. That phrase is the hinge of his response to accusations of cruelty. It does not erase the suffering that preceded it. It does not make the rubble any less real. What it does do is assert a principle, that command is not vindicated by stubbornness, and that preventing needless deaths is itself a moral duty, even when it requires harsh action. So when people ask what Patton said after being accused of cruelty, the answer is both simple and complex. He spoke a moral condemnation of commands that cost lives for pride. He acknowledged the slaughter and judged its cause. He used the bitter calculus of war to justify a severe remedy, one aimed at stopping future waste. Whether history forgives the method is a debate for another day. The moment itself remains a study in the collision between honor, obedience, and the duty to preserve life. What do you think? Was his rebuke a necessary enforcement of judgment, or a cruelty dressed as strategy? Share your view in the comments, and if you want sources and the reading list behind this episode, check the description. If this kind of historical examination interests you, subscribe and keep exploring the difficult choices that shape the past.